Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, how will the nation emerge from protests and a pandemic? Senator Martha McSally says America has a broken spirit. The Arizona lawmaker joins host Dave Anthony to weigh in on what the country's leaders must do to restore peace and help Americans feel safe and secure again. Also, will civil unrest disrupt the U.S. economy's coronavirus recovery? Neil Cavuto, anchor of Your World on the Fox News Channel and Coast to Coast on Fox Business, joins host Lisa Brady to discuss how protests could affect the economic bounce back and businesses. Plus commentary by co-anchor of Fox and Friends and the host of The Brian Kilmeade Show, Brian Kilmeade. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
Janice Dean.
I'm David Asman.
I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020. I'm Dave Anthony. Protests have raged across America for more than a week. Some peaceful, some destructive. Republican Senator Martha McSally tells us,
we're at a very pivotal moment. Our spirit is broken, and we've got to figure out how to move past this and work together at all levels, leadership levels, local levels, whatever it's going to take. But violence is not the answer.
I'm Lisa Brady. America's reopening gets interrupted. How much could civil unrest slow down the pandemic recovery?
The irony will be that, the virus conditions have improved enough to go back to work, but people are now with the opinion, gee, maybe I shouldn't.
And I'm Brian Kilmeade. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
the tension across America is even thicker. After 2 months of coronavirus shutdowns, more than a week of destructive protests over George Floyd's death in Minneapolis.
The country is crying out for leadership.
Presumed Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden.
Is this who we are? Is this who we want to be? Is this who we want to pass on to our children and our grandchildren? Fear, anger, finger pointing.
But he pointed a finger at President Trump.
He thinks division helps him. His narcissism has become more important than the nation's well-being that he leads.
Biden is calling for widespread police reform.
I'll seek to heal the racial wounds that have long plagued our country, not use them for political gain.
But that's just what the Trump campaign claims Biden is doing, crassly using the unrest to benefit his candidacy. Republican Senator John Cornyn told Fox.
He painted broadly against all of our law enforcement agencies across the country, which I think is grotesquely unfair.
Another GOP senator tells us we need calm as thousands of National Guard troops help police across the country.
I saw a convoy of military vehicles go by, and I had to just do a double take. I did. I've been deployed 6 times. It just was a scene that I never thought I would see in Washington, D.C.
Senator Martha McSally from Arizona is also a retired Air Force colonel.
I contrast it with the restaurants who were scrambling in a frenzy to put up wood over their glass out of fear for the rioters and the looters right as they were just getting ready and just starting to open back up after the pandemic. These hardworking restaurant owners who poured their whole lives into the restaurant on top of the coronavirus, now they are scrambling before the curfew to board up their windows, hoping and praying that their facility doesn't get destroyed in the evening riots. It's just this is unbelievable that we are in this situation. And look, everybody should watch the video of the murder of George Floyd. Everybody. As a human being, you shouldn't look away. But what we're seeing happen in our streets right now is those who are more interested in anarchy and in violence, not in the memory of George Floyd, not in an honest, serious conversation about how we're going to not look away from how that police officer in broad daylight was able to snuff that man's life out while others stood around and enabled and watched him. But that's not what's going on right now. Now we have destruction happening to innocent people, and it's got to stop. And it's time for us to unite. This isn't about you're a Republican or Democrat. We got to work together. We got to get through this moment in our country. It's a pivotal moment. We must get through it together.
Now, Senator, some have said that this is something that they have to do, that they have to get people's attention, that they need to do this kind of thing with destruction in addition to peaceful protesting, because peaceful protesting doesn't always get the attention and doesn't always work. They need to make change happen now.
There's nothing that excuses violence. There's just nothing. I hear their voice. I share their disgust about the callous, despicable death of George Floyd and the other examples in the past. I hear you. I cannot begin to relate to what it's like to be an African-American man or woman in America, but I'm listening. We need to solve this problem together, but nothing justifies violence. Nothing.
What would you want done about policing in the wake of what has happened? Would you want Congress to get involved in any way?
We're having conversations. I'm open to ideas, but we first have to address the full justice for the murder of George Floyd. I'm talking to local leaders back in Arizona. What more can be done? It's not a perfect analogy, but I was in the military. I don't understand how the Minneapolis Police Department got to the place where that was allowed to happen. I don't understand. Leadership matters, culture matters, accountability matters, and I got a lot of questions as to what the hell was going on in that police department. And people need to be held accountable, not just the murderer, but the facilitators and others in the leadership who created this environment, it appears. So there's so much that needs to be looked at, not just there, but in other places as well. But as a country, we've got to get through this together. We're at a very pivotal moment. Our spirit is broken, and we've got to figure out how to move past this and work together at all levels, leadership levels, local levels, whatever it's going to take. But violence is not the answer.
The president has wanted more governors to call out the National Guard. There have been tens of thousands of troops already deployed. There are some Democratic governors who say, look, soldiers on the streets is not the answer. What do you think?
Well, in Arizona, we had a curfew. We've had some rioting and looting over the weekend, and the curfew started, and there have been some challenges. But they've been able to provide the very fundamental public safety. That's the responsibility of law enforcement. And if local law enforcement can't do it on their own, that's part of the purpose of the National Guard. And for those who are the business owners whose entire lives are being impacted, to those who feel threatened because of the violence and the looting and the rioting, the whole purpose of law enforcement is to protect society. And so it's up to the individuals to not be involved, do not participate in this violence and looting, do not stand by and watch it. I am so proud of the people who I've seen actually stand in the way. You see some of these protesters who are just saying, no, do not. We're here to support George Floyd and to speak out on these other issues. Please don't turn this into, a violent encounter. And those people need to be held accountable. And local leaders need to provide law and order and safety on their streets while we continue to have this conversation about how to not have something like George Floyd happen again.
All this as senators still consider whether to approve more spending to help people still hurting from the coronavirus shutdowns. Last month, House Democrats approved a $3 trillion bill on top of the nearly $3 trillion Congress passed earlier, but the Senate hasn't acted on that.
Whatever we need to do to get the economy in afterburner and defeat this virus, if we've got to do more legislation, let's focus on that in a bipartisan way like we did in the past. This is not time to play politics. It's time to support small businesses, support workers who have been impacted, incentivizing. Let's get back to being in a strong economic situation like we were while we're still having to defeat the virus. We can do both of them together, and I think Arizona has been a model. I've been out to restaurants, I've gotten my hair cut, I've gotten a pedicure. They're doing things differently, but I'm supporting those local businesses out there, and we can do that safely.
Now, we've had about 40 million people file for unemployment since the middle of March. Do you think that maybe more money needs to go out, another stimulus check for everybody, more extra unemployment? I know people also worry that the unemployment that has gone out is paying some people more than they actually got when they were working. So what do you think needs to be done there?
I've heard stories of individuals not being willing to come back to work. That's actually not allowed by labor law. You can't quit your job or refuse a job and get unemployment. I think Arizonans want to work. I'll just speak for my state. We've got small businesses that are needing to continue to bring people back on the payroll while they're able to safely open, but at lower capacity. So whatever we need to do that provides support so more people don't fall into food and housing insecurity while supporting those people who are creating jobs for Arizonans and Americans, we've got to get people back to work in a safe way, get that economic activity going in, get that revenue coming in.
Martha McSally was appointed to the Senate by Arizona's governor to fill the late Senator John McCain's seat after she lost a 2018 bid for the state's other seat. Now, there's a special election this year, and McSally's Democratic challenger is Mark Kelly, who said in a campaign video,
I learned a lot from being an astronaut. I learned a lot from being a pilot in the Navy. I learned a lot about solving problems from being an engineer. But what I learned from my wife is how you use policy to improve people's lives.
Kelly's wife is former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, who was shot in the head back in 2011, but survived, rehabbed, and is now a gun control advocate. There are several reports that polls have Kelly leading Senator McSally, which is worrying the Trump campaign. The president tweeted Tuesday that she is tough, tested, and true, calling her a fighter. And he recommended McSally's new book, which we will get to in a moment.
Well, Dave, I think people are tired of politicians. All they do is focus on their next election. That's one reason I went from 26 years in the military to yelling at the television, what's the matter with those people, to look at myself in the mirror and saying, well, what are you going to do about it? Get in the arena and do your part. Here we are at this consequential place in our country. I think the best thing that I can do is be a good senator and fight for Arizonans, make a difference for them. Yes, we have this very important fight coming up. I think most Americans understand it's the most consequential election in our lifetime. And the best thing I can do with only a 2-year opportunity is to be a good senator. But I'm standing between making sure that Senate majority doesn't flip. I'm standing on the wall to make sure that we don't have Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, and Joe Biden in charge and their extreme agenda on the left. I look at it like my dad died when I was 12. If this is the last year of my life, what am I doing to make a difference right now for Arizonans? And I'm honored to be able to serve them right now, and I'm going to continue to fight so I can continue to serve them in the future.
I know you wrote about your dad and your time in the military. You have a new book. Congratulations. It's called Dare to Fly, Simple Lessons in Never Giving Up. It was just released late last month.
I share my stories going from a pudgy, shy, motion-sick girl who lost my dad when I was 12 to becoming the first woman to fly a fighter jet in combat, command a fighter squadron in combat. Also stories of taking on the Pentagon in an 8-year battle and, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro and running Ironman triathlons and other things. And those may be unique stories. But my purpose of the book was to be a wingman to the reader. So I would provide them practical ways that they can overcome fear in their own lives. They can overcome their own adversity and pain. They can push past their own barriers.
You mentioned you're obviously the first female to fly a combat mission. How difficult was it to get to that point and to reach that mark?
It was difficult, but you don't just go from, again, being a shy, motion-sick kid to just jumping into a fighter plane. So I share in very practical ways how anybody can overcome their own fear. Anybody can build courage. I don't think we're not born with courage. And so the day I was cleared for takeoff, for example, in the A-10, it was a 10-year journey to get there from when I went to the Air Force Academy and said, I want to be a fighter pilot. And it was against the law. And I was like, we live in America. Laws change. 10 years later, I'm cleared for takeoff in the summer of 1994. No two-seat planes, no simulators. I'd never flown it before. And I share the very practical stories of how I found my courage in that moment and how I built my courage over time like an athlete building muscle memory and choices I made in my life to allow me to not have absence of fear, but push up the power and learn how to take off afraid. And so I share with the reader how you can do things afraid in your own life and build your own courage. I think we could use a little bit of that right now. Everybody could.
Well, it's a lot of things going on for all of us at this moment, and you especially working in the Senate. Senator Martha McSally, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Dave. You can go to daretofly.us, get your book, and also share your stories with me. God bless you all. Stay safe out there.
This is Brian Kilmeade with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
They went from shut down to boarded up. Businesses trying to protect themselves from looters.
We're a growing business. We just bought a bunch of new equipment, had it all literally stacked in here from a couple weeks ago.
John Lemp's security camera recording as thieves picked through his ransacked TV business in Santa Monica.
And just to watch it all just getting yanked out was, it's devastating to watch.
Businesses of all sizes gutted or burned, windows shattered, as peaceful protests give way to violence night after night.
When you loot a business, you're not just taking goods, you're destroying someone's dreams.
Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and many other officials condemning the damage being done to minority-owned small businesses in some cases, even as the family of George Floyd also calls for peace. The civil unrest sweeping a nation just beginning to emerge from coronavirus restrictions.
I've covered World Bank, protests that happen in places like Seattle in the past. So this is a little different in that this seems to grow on its own besides just the city where leaders are meeting.
Neil Cavuto is the host of Your World on Fox News Channel and Coast to Coast on Fox Business.
This spread like wildfire throughout the country, and I think that makes it very, very different. A lot of people make the comparison, to 1968 and racial and other riots that sort of took the nation by storm. I see those similarities, but there is a difference in that we're technically not at war for the time being. We're just coming out of a virus that's gripped much of the world. So there are differences, but it is, it's obviously unnerving. And I think the fact that this tends to have spawned worldwide protest, even in New Zealand and Australia, obviously throughout Europe, Latin America. It's hit a chord. It's definitely hit a chord that makes it very, very distinct.
Do you have a sense of how the recovery, the economic recovery from the pandemic was going before the violent part of the protests started, the damage to businesses? I mean, in some areas, it looked like people were definitely ready to go shopping, to eat at restaurants, for instance. Do we know how that was going?
Well, it was going fairly well, and the rollout as more states and cities were continuing their reopenings was pretty favorable. There were, some spikes here and there, but well within the margin that a lot of the medical experts had thought. And then this happened. I do find it interesting that Wall Street has held its own, that if not continued advancing on the belief that it will settle down, that the underlying economy is sound. I've heard those kind of arguments in the past, but it is unique in that it's not rattling investors yet. It's certainly rattling average folks, but investors don't seem to think it will amount to much more than these protests. The fear is that it escalates out of control if the president makes good on using the military to crack down. Obviously, that has shades of 1968 built into it, and fears that it just spirals into this total bedlam. But investors for now have been very, I wouldn't say blasé about it, but actually they've been a little bit dismissive of it, thinking that the worries that people have that this leads to full-blown anarchy are just not there.
So I guess in terms of how much it could disrupt the recovery depends on how it shakes out, whether or not it does settle down, how that happens.
Well, absolutely. I think that, be careful what you dismiss. I think it's a little cavalier to say, well, this isn't going to affect what I'm going to do. But think about it, Lisa. Well, these the folks who are planning eventually to go back either in various phases to their jobs, knowing that New York City is presently under this curfew, would you be eager to go back into the city? Similarly in Chicago and Philadelphia and Atlanta and Minneapolis, obviously the center of all of this. It is going to affect people's judgment call as to whether it's safe to go back. So the irony will be that, the virus conditions have improved enough to go back to work, but people are now of the opinion, gee, maybe I shouldn't.
Yeah, it's interesting how maybe we would have thought the big cultural change would be more people working from home, but now we have an entirely different cultural change that might be coming about in the country in the not too distant future because of everything that's happening. And I know Nordstrom, for instance, I just wanted to ask you too about the different company responses to this, because that's something else that feels different in this civil unrest compared to the past. Nordstrom sent out an email to customers saying it's heartbroken by what it calls the senseless deaths, and they list George Floyd and others by name, and they say tremendous change is needed to address the issues facing Black people in our country today. Now, is this indicative of a collective desire for change or just a desire for the looting to stop? I know it's kind of a cynical question, but it's a question.
No, it really isn't, Lisa. It's a very good question. I always find that after calamities like this, I heard one analyst tell me recently, they get a conscience sometimes too late. But Bank of America pledging $1 billion to assist in economic, racial inequality and get to the bottom of that. You mentioned Nordstrom. You mentioned a host of others that are exploring ways to understand the communities in which they're in. Of course, if you're Target and you've seen more than 24 of your stores, looted or damaged as a result of protests, naturally going to put out a statement that you're working with those communities, to get to the bottom of the problem. Having said that, Target still has, half a dozen or more stores closed until further notice to get to the bottom of it. So they have to balance and explaining to their public and their shareholders how it is. Let's say in Amazon's case, Lisa, they're cutting and limiting deliveries in some of the cities that have been rocked by these protests. But at the same time, putting out statements, we have to have a dialogue or something to that effect. I'm not quoting it exactly, where they want to understand those communities. So they're trying to have it both ways. It's very, very tough. You're saying and doing all the right things. But obviously, if you're Bank of America or you're an Amazon or you're CVS and you're looking at, dozens of your stores closed as a result of this, you have to balance business that's been clearly impacted by this and be very cognizant of the fact that you're drawing back on that business, but also with a sympathetic, ear to the complaints themselves. It's a very, very tough position for businesses.
Some of the most heartwarming images are of people helping, just people in their community helping businesses to clean up, regardless of what type of business, just going out there unsolicited. And, the morning after, the latest violence, the latest looting, and just trying to help and working, as a community. Big difference between what happens in the daytime and what happens at night in a lot of the areas where these protests are taking place. I wanted to ask you something on a positive note, if it's possible, about businesses that have actually been thriving during the pandemic, either because they're more in demand, because people were staying at home, or because they've reinvented themselves. One example would be that company in Maryland that pivoted and started making bumper tables.
Right.
And I don't know how well they're doing, but it's sometimes these sort of desperate times do breed innovation, right?
Well, it is amazing to see. Now, obviously, some are almost no-brainers. Amazon, you can see if people are sheltered at home, they'll shop at home, and Amazon a big beneficiary of that. Walmart, a very strong online presence, big beneficiary of that. Of course, stores did and have remained open throughout this, albeit with, the checks on how many people go into those stores. But it's those who make it as easy as possible who benefited. I also find that a lot of the food delivery services that have a product that's known and identifiable, Domino's comes to mind, the pizza folks. I mean, those who make it easy and are familiar brands did very well, and I imagine they'll do well post this.
One last quick one, because I know you have to run, but the second quarter, how bad do you think it'll be for the second quarter GDP?
Awful. It'll be just awful. But it's well telegraphed that it's going to be awful, Lisa. I think depending on how people want to look at it, we could see the economy decline anywhere from 30 to 40%. But it's all factored in. We already know kind of what was going on in every week and every month of the quarter. And we already know that the numbers were record low numbers, record low retail sales, record low personal income and spending numbers. We're grateful if they're just a little bit better than awful, if they're just really awful. But we already know that. Now, the question going forward is, do we bounce back from that? The third quarter seems to be the best shot at doing that. A lot of these numbers are computed quarter over quarter. So the third quarter, just based on the lousy second quarter, will exponentially be a lot better. We already know that as well. And then you get to the fourth quarter, we could be rounding to bend. There are a lot of people optimistic for 2021, saying we could go off to the races. I'm not in the camp that says it's going to be a V-shaped recovery. You go from zero capacity to at least some capacity in restaurants, stores. It isn't full capacity. So that takes time, but it will. We're already prepared, not only for lousy employment numbers and a lousy GDP for these months we're in and the second quarter as a whole, that people are prepared for that. What they're hoping for and what guides the markets is the light at the end of the tunnel, and that is that it gets better from here.
Fingers crossed. Neil Cavuto,
Exactly.
host of Your World on Fox News Channel and Coast to Coast on Fox Business. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Lisa, very much.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. Download and listen to Everyone Talks to Liz. Fox Business's Liz Klayman talks with entrepreneurs and executives about inspiring and motivational stories. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Brian Kilmeade.
What's on your mind?
We watch chaos in major cities, and everyone's focusing on Donald Trump's walk to St. John's Church or the fact that he has offered and may give military support to the cities that are out of control. Hey, governors, hey, mayors, don't worry about what Donald Trump is saying. Don't worry about where he's walking. Get your cities under control. Get your state under control. And I'm talking to you, Pritzker, and I'm talking to you, Cuomo. Don't worry about the walk. Don't worry about the military. Your cities are full of chaos, mayhem, to steal the New York Post term. Get it under control. And why is it that these governors and mayors seem to get a pass? Because they're Democrats. They're the ones directly responsible for what's going on. Cuomo is a joke to have an 11 o'clock curfew. Why bother? Why not make it 2 in the morning and have mandatory 8-hour sleep, none of which will ever happen or affect anything else? There are infiltrators into your city beyond protesters about racial inequity and law enforcement policies. There are people coming in there to destroy the country, and they're doing it by destroying the places that you're in charge of. So pull it all together. There was a stat that said 77% of white people trust the local police. Only 36% of black people do. Let's work on that. You want to make the country better? Let's have a dialogue. Let's have policies that address that have blacks, whites, leaders, everyday people, as well as, guess who else? Law enforcement involved in the conversation. They don't have to be bad guys. We're all on the same side. We just want to make it better. But those rioters who are tearing apart our cities are the bad guys. Stop focusing on the president and bring some semblance of normalcy to your state, to your city. I'm Brian Kilmeade, and that's what I think.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust, and click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.